So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This webinar today is going to be about assessing intercultural and global competence. Just a few housekeeping items before we dive in, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with Zoom at this point, but just so you know, we're using the Zoom webinar feature today. And even us who are very experienced apparently had disabled the chat. So there you go. It's always good to get a reminder. As I mentioned, for those who connected earlier, we do have live transcript available. So you can click on captions if you want to enable them. Of course, and I see many of you doing that already, please feel free to share greetings, comments, and any relevant links in the chat. We will have a designated time for questions and answers and discussion at the end. We're saving a lot of time for that, but feel free as speakers share to add your questions to the Q&A. We'll be collecting those so we can address them at the Q&A section. And finally, as I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on AFS YouTube channel. If you are a social media user, Twitter, if you're still there, and LinkedIn, feel free to use hashtag AFSEffect, hashtag IEW2022, and tag AFS. And if you are taking screenshots, just make sure we look nice if you share them, not with eyes closed and all of that. And I'm really happy to welcome you today. I'm your host. My name is Ana Carolina Cassiano. I go by Caro, and I work for AFS for about almost 10 years now. I'm currently head of education development, and I oversee the education content of our study abroad programs, our initiatives for educators and schools, including virtual teacher trainings, and amongst other things. And one of the topics I'm very interested about, and I'm just starting to explore more, is about assessment. So we're really lucky to have some experts, and I'll be learning with you as we go over this webinar today. So just so why AFS is doing this and offering this webinar this week, we are celebrating International Education Week. This is a week that was an initiative by the Department of State in the US, and now it's widespread and we celebrate in many other places in the world. And it's really an opportunity to showcase what are the benefits of international education and exchange worldwide. And as that's one of the core things we do, exchanges and promoting intercultural education through different offerings at AFS, we thought this would be a good opportunity to invite others in the field to have these conversations with us. And if you go into our website, afs.org/IEW, you'll be able to find the other webinars we're offering this week and register for them. And all recordings will be available on YouTube channel as well in case you can't make it. And many topics will be covered later today, at least for my time zone, it's later today. We'll have one on virtual exchange. Tomorrow we'll be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in international education, and many other topics. So for those of you who might be new to AFS, just before we dive into our webinar, I just wanted to share with you a little bit about who is AFS. AFS is a global nonprofit, non-governmental organization that is volunteer-based. It was founded in 1914 during the First World War as a volunteer service to help collect wounded people from the war from both sides. And what they learned from that, not only this spirit of voluntarism, but that in order to avoid future wars, that would be really important to foster intercultural understanding. That's why in 1947, so over 75 years ago now at this point, AFS started offering intercultural exchange programs, and over the years we expanded our offerings to other ways to foster intercultural learning and intercultural education. So we're currently at 113 countries with the support of 55 AFS national organizations. And each year we send or host abroad, go on exchange to 12,000 students. And At this point, we have over 500,000 alumni worldwide. And as I was mentioning, it's not only through exchange that AFS does, but also as a mission-driven organization. These are our 3 impact goals. To develop active global citizens through our different offerings. So not only people that go abroad and go exchange, but they can really put into practice for our collective well-being, these intercultural and global competences they are developing. We also support schools by helping them globalize their curriculum and other educational institutions. And a key concern of ours is also to expand access to intercultural education, not only by providing scholarships and giving people the ability to reach these programs, but also making sure we are reaching audiences that sometimes are not reached through these programs, and designing programs that have in mind for design being inclusive and accessible. So that's enough about AFS and International Education Week. And before I present you our speakers, who you might be seeing on screen already, we would like to get to know who is connected with us today. I know many of you shared on the chat already, but we would love to get a visual representation of this. And we have some questions for you as well about who you are and where you are connecting from. We'll be using Menti for that. So you can use the QR code on the screen with your smartphone or other mobile device, or open your browser. If you are in your computer, go to menti.com and digit the code in the screen. And Dylan also shared on the chat a direct link. If you click, it should go directly for it. So I'll give you a few minutes to connect there. And I see many people are already there. In case you can see it, I'll be repeating the questions out loud here as well, in case you can access the Menti, and feel free to share your answers on the chat as well. And let's see how these Menti results are looking like. So the first question we have there is a world map, and you're asked to pin where you are connecting from. And you can see on my screen, we have a pretty global representation. People in the Americas, North America, Central America, South America, maybe some fellow countries, men and women from Brazil, lots of places in Europe, very small here, so hard to tell where, but I know Italy is here, some parts of Africa, and Eastern Asia. There is one up there in the Pacific Ocean. I'm not sure, maybe you are in Hawaii. Let us know on the chat. And if you can't see, I see some doing that. You can type on the chat in case you can see the map which country you are connecting from. And thank you for giving us this visual. There is, keep on that Menti, because we have 2 more questions for you. The first is, what is your field of work? And we would love to get a visual of who is connecting here today. How do you identify as a higher education faculty, administrator, researcher, non-formal education practitioner like myself, working at AFS, K-12 teacher, have many teachers that collaborate with AFS, student at any grade level, or maybe other. And if other, please share on the chat, what is this other? What is your field of work? Oh, a lot of higher education administrators, faculty, non-formal education practitioners, students, researchers, a couple of teachers, K-12, and others. Curious about the others. And another question we have up there is, just so we can get a temperature of the room, is what is your level of experience with the topic we're covering today? Is it something you're very experienced in and you want to dive deeper today? Are you new to intercultural and global competence assessment and came here to learn the basics? From the answers we have so far, I see we're somewhere in the middle. People are somewhat experienced with intercultural and global competence assessment. That's where I would place myself as well. Good. And finally, our last question here. If you could share with us just in a few words, what do you expect to get out of this webinar today? Is it some new tools and methods? Is it best practices, examples, share on results? Oh, I see some answers coming up. Update on what AFS is doing. Good. Professional development, more familiarity with ICC assessment tools, tools to use in the classroom. Oh, we are going to tackle lots of those tools and methods, hear how the field is progressing, increasing global cultural awareness, listening to the world experts on this matter, include in ESL classes. Good. Ideas for assessment, professional development, new ideas, to do a voluntary work with AFS in Spain and or USA. Oh, that's interesting. Voluntary work on assessment, we would love that. Wonderful. So without no further ado, let's dive into this. And let me go back to our presentation. And if you haven't added yet, feel free to add the Menti as we go, so we can look at it later once the webinar is done, your input. But let me introduce you our speakers today. First, we have Mattia Baiutti, connecting from Northern Italy. Mattia is in charge of teacher training and research at Fondazione Intercultura and Intercultura, which is AFS in Italy. We also have Katherine Yngve, who works at Purdue University. She'll share a little bit more about her role shortly. And we have Curtis Chu, who is connecting from Japan. And he is also starting in research. He's an administrator and teacher assistant at the Global Education Center at Setsunan University. So thank you, our speakers, for connecting. And without no further ado, let's dive into this topic. So we're going to start with Mattia, hearing a little bit about assessing international pupil mobility. And he's going to talk about the best practices from Intercultura through the Intercultura assessment protocol. Then we're going to hear from Katherine about study abroad intercultural learning outcomes assessment and some of the key learnings from what she's been working on, mainly on higher education. And then we're going to hear from Curtis about virtual mobility assessment and the current work he's doing on mapping of global practices of ICC assessment. And finally, we'll have tons of time for questions and discussion. As they are speaking again, feel free to add your answers already to the Q&A so we can capture them. Mattia, I'll hand over to you, and if you can share a few more words about yourself and what drove your interest in intercultural competence and global competence assessment.
So thank you, Carol, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all of you, and happy International Education Week. So Carol asking me to speak a bit about this Intercultura assessment protocol, and in particular, she asking me to explain why and how we developed this tool to assess intercultural competence of pupils who spend a long-term period abroad. So let's start with the why. I began my research in the field of pupil mobility around 10 years ago, when I was a PhD student with a study that was founded by Fondazione Intercultura. And at that time, I didn't know anything about pupil mobility, AFS, Intercultura, and so on and so forth. But immediately, I find myself totally in line with the values promoted by Intercultura AFS. In particular, so with this pupil mobility idea, but not every pupil mobility. So the point was that the main aspect that I really like about pupil mobility is when pupil mobility is understood as an educational program. And because of this, we have to ask what pupils are expecting to learn during the period abroad. And behind the disciplinary competence of such history, maths, and so on and so forth, and also behind the proficiency in one or more languages or dialogue, one of the main educational learning outcome of this experience is intercultural competence. However, the fact that this is an intended learning outcome doesn't mean that all the students develop intercultural competence. So this is the reason why it's really important to assess the intercultural competence of pupil mobility. The point is that assessment is always a huge issues, in particular with this kind of competencies. And as my dearest colleague Roberto Rufino always say to us is, what is not assessed in school, it doesn't exist. So it's really important to work on the assessment of intercultural competence. So, and this is why we decide to run a research in collaboration with the University of Udine, and in particular, this is our research question. So basically, what are the tools specifically for secondary school in order to assess the intercultural competence of that returnees who spend 1 year abroad with an international individual pupil mobility. So in order to answer to this question, design a working protocol, and this protocol was then piloted through an action research which involved more than 100 secondary school teachers from almost all the region of Italy, as we can see in the next slide. So all these teachers had at that time 1 pupil who was studying abroad with a year-long individual pupil mobility program organized by Intercultura. But also, since this is a very complex topic, we decided to involve an international group of experts, in particular, some names that you might know, like, for example, Darla Dierdorf, Veronica Boix-Mansilla, Mike Byram, Martin Barrett, also some analysts from the OECD PISA, also Franz Baxter, that she's going to give a presentation during this week. So we did this research for the school, but with the school. So there was really important idea that it was an action research. And what came out at the end of this research is this Intercultura assessment protocol that we can see now in the next slide. So the Intercultura assessment protocol follow a multi-method, a multi-prospective, and longitudinal approach. So what does it mean exactly? So this means that while a pupil is abroad and during the first month when he or she come back to the sending school, teacher has to conduct a systematic process of collecting and analyzing direct and indirect evidence related to the pupil's intercultural learning objective. So as you can see from the slide, this collection of data has to be conducted with different tools. This is the reason why we call multi-method approach. So here, for example, we have logbooks, presentation of the experience abroad, reality test, observation form, other document, and so on and so forth. But also from multiple sources. So, and this is the reason why we call multi-prospective approach. Not only from the teacher, but as well from the pupil who spend the period abroad, but as well from the classmates. So we speak about peer assessment. Then we have school staff, volunteers from AFS, and so on and so forth. Then teachers have to relate and contrast all the gathered data. Based on this, they need to define the level for each component of intercultural competence achieved by the student. And this project is guided by a report on the assessment rubric. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that what we mean with longitudinal approach. So we have to use some tools when the student needs abroad, so during the experience abroad, but also some tools when they come back. The point is that all the tools that we are using are formative assessment tools, but the summative assessment tool is the rubric. And since we have no time to go into all the singular tools, we just focus 1 minute on the rubric, which is the core of this assessment. So can we go to the next slide, please? So as you will see in a second, this is just an extract of the rubric, but I would like to show you how it's organized. So the rubric is an analytic chart, and the structure of it includes 3 fundamental dimensions, like in this case, the skills, but also we have attitude and knowledge. For each dimension, there are 2 or 3 criteria understood as the components of each dimension, such as curiosity, knowledge of context, and so on and so forth. And for each criterion, there are 3 levels, as you can see in this slide: basic level, intermediate level, and advanced level, which indicate the progression in proficiency. For each level, there is at least one descriptor that we understood as a specific and measurable learning outcome statement, which describe what the student should be able to do if he or she master a target level of proficiency. And these descriptors describe something that is observable, so something that we can see, but also something that we infer from the data that we collected. And since these descriptors are also general, we provide some example. So this is something that you might find useful in order to assess the pupil mobility learning outcomes. But in general, next slide, what we think is the value of this Intercultura assessment protocol is that is a contextualized tools, because it was created with the collaboration of the school, in specific with the teacher, but at the same time is an educational tool, because it not only assess the intercultural competence, but from the study we understand that this kind of assessment is a way also to enhance the intercultural competence. And finally, we also find another interesting point that it would be really important, that this tool help also teachers to understand the pedagogy underpinning pupil mobility, because as we know, sometimes teacher has some prejudice against pupil mobility. Oh my God, they go to holiday, they miss our curriculum, and so on and so forth. But because they don't exactly know what is pupil mobility. So in this way, they become familiar of what is the pedagogy that is behind pupil mobility. So where you can find all this, it's in open access. So we just a couple of months ago launched this website. It's all in Italian, but as well in English. You will find all the PDF of the tools and also the publication. And so you can download whatever you want about the Intercultural Assessment Protocol, and you can write to me if you want to know anything else. But I also want to conclude this saying that, in the next slide, we decide to, to train teacher about in general, internationalization of education, pupil mobility, intercultural competence, but in particular also on this tool. And now we are doing a lot of teacher training in person, blended, or through webinars. And we see that this help to adopt formally in, at least in Italy, we hope more in other parts of the world, this Intercultural assessment protocol. And in this way, we believe that all this effort might help to spread a good culture of pupil mobility, and so educate active global citizenship. So thank you for your attention. And Carol, I send to you the word.
Perfect. Thank you, Mattia. Thank you so much for this overview of how you got to the assessment of intercultural competence, and how was the development of the protocol, and some of the insights of what it looks like. We will address the questions later, but we'll keep one in the chat, and I'll hand over now to Katherine. Katherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And we can move to the first slide, I think. Yeah, okay. So what ignited my interest in assessment? It was really all the dean's fault. So in 1999, actually, I think I'm the only person on this panel who's been assessing in 2 different centuries. I went to work for a small liberal arts college in St. Paul, Minnesota, Macalester College, which sent then about 65% of every graduating class abroad for at least a semester, most of them for a semester. And I think it's now up to 70%. I was at that time the director of study abroad, or study away, because we did both domestic and international. And the dean was constantly saying, yes, we're sending them abroad, we're spending a lot of scholarship money, letting them go abroad. And are they actually learning anything? I was not a trained researcher at that time. So my method was a qualitative method. At the end of the semester for each student, so that's about 125 students a semester, I asked them 3 questions. What surprised you most about your study abroad experience, and why? What did you learn, and have you changed, and if so, how? And if they didn't answer these questions, we wouldn't give them their grades. So everybody answered, because of course they wanted the grades on their transcript from study abroad. And over a period of semester after semester looking at this data, I realized that some of my students, and particularly the students who were majoring in the hard sciences, although our college was very supportive of learning, did not seem to be having the same learning experience as other students. I really wanted to understand more about pedagogy. As Dr. Baiutti has mentioned, it's important to understand the pedagogy, and you have to be able to assess it. And so I entered into graduate studies at that time at the University of Minnesota. Next slide, please. So what assessment tools do I use in my context? My context is an unusual one. I used to be, as I said, a study abroad advisor. I am now an assessment expert working within the institutional research office at a large research university in the USA, Research One University, at which the faculty have required intercultural competence should occur for every undergraduate in their degree program at the university. That's been a requirement since 2012, and I was hired here in 2014 as an assessment specialist. Next slide. Because of that background, I have to support faculty and advisors and instructors of all kinds who believe that intercultural competence is many things. They maybe think that intercultural competence is understanding how to solve climate change. They may think that intercultural competence means understanding power and privilege and supporting equity and inclusion. They may think that it means foreign language competence. So I have become an expert, I guess, in all kinds of ways of measuring intercultural competence or global competence, which are related but 2 different things. That's actually a screenshot of me being an expert for AFS in Montreal. And list at that time, I was aiming to get over 50 different assessment tools in this Hubicle collection. The Hubicle is the intercultural learning. It's a free resource that Purdue provides to the world. And the link at the top links to all of the assessments that we have curated, listed, told you something about them in the Hubicle, whereas the link at the bottom is a separate list put together by a member of the World Council on Intercultural and Global Competence, intercultural assessment group. So you can go to either of those things to see more about assessments than you've ever wanted to know in your life. Next slide, please. So the ones in specific that I use in my research as an institutional researcher for Purdue, and not in this order necessarily, the four that I use most commonly are the Intercultural Development Inventory, the Beliefs, Events, and Values Inventory, the Intercultural Competence Rubric from AAC&U, and the Mayville-Guzman Universality Diversity Scale. So the Intercultural Competence Rubric is the one that we use for making sense of qualitative data. I have told our Italian department that they ought to have a look at Dr. Baiutti's instrument, but I don't know that they're using it. At this URL that I think Dylan dropped into the chat, if you go to this page, which is about the recommended assessment instruments, you'll see short videos that I have provided, about 5 minutes each, listing the advantages and disadvantages of these major tools and a couple of others, as well as there's a half-hour video where Dr. Aletha Stahl and I, she used to be a professor of French before she joined the Purdue team, mostly formative instruments that we feel are underused, and we kind of, in a debate format in half an hour, cover about 13 of the instruments that are in our collections. Next slide, please. Thank you, Dylan. So some of our key findings and learnings that I've personally been involved in writing about for Purdue are that short-term study abroad can be as impactful as a semester abroad, even when you measure with a tool as rigorous as the Intercultural Development Inventory. The virtual study abroad can be as transformational as physical study abroad, and that on-campus learning can be as transformational as physical study abroad. Now, the operative word here is can. You have to have good pedagogy, you have to have good design, you've got to have mentoring going on for the students, and I would say also that the professors have to understand how intercultural pedagogy works. And you can read about that in these reports that are listed here that Dylan's been diligently putting the URLs into the thing for you. And one final slide before we pass it over to Dr. Chu. The interesting thing about being a researcher at this university is one of our goals is to help the faculty and the staff publish and do research about how their context, their populations are learning and how we make that better. So there's a research repository of publications on the Intercultural Learning Hub. You do not have to make an account on the Intercultural Learning Hub to access these publications, and you can go to that URL and see stuff, not just like the reports that I've done, but things that our director of the Office of Professional Practice in the College of Engineering has done, and things that graduate students have done, and so forth. And you can download those articles for free and learn a lot more about intercultural pedagogy and intercultural assessment. So I think that's all for now. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Carol, for inviting me. And thank you to my co-panelists for also being here. It's been a delight.
Thank you so much, Katherine, and thank you for giving us an overview in a very short time of a long and vast trajectory with assessment. It was good to get to know how you got started and your experience with all these tools. I'm sure this is bringing already some questions to the chat and will generate some discussion, but we can address them afterwards unless you want to address now.
I saw
Yes.
one that I'd like to answer real
course.
quick. I think about, do we use IDI with group debrief or individual debrief? It depends. We have about 100 people who are qualified here on campus. So we've made a major investment in that particular tool. And sometimes we do individual and sometimes we just do group depending on what they want. But that's all I'll answer for now, just to give appropriate time to.
Thank you so much, Katherine. And we'll move now to Curtis too, who will share with us, also in the higher education field, but his experience with assessment of virtual mobility, and as well some other questions that have been popping up on global mapping of ICC assessment practices. Curtis?
Okay. Thank you, Carol. Thanks, Katherine. Thanks to co-panelists, and hello, everyone. Hello from Japan. So if I'm not making too much sense, please know that it's 11:30 here and I'm feeling a bit sleepy. So I think what distinguishes me with our other co-panelists are that we have researchers like Mattia and Katherine, but for me, I'm a practitioner. So can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So this ignited my interest. I have lived and worked in 4 countries. I was born in the East, I was raised in the West. And since early childhood, I kind of have this awareness of cultural differences, like people are different. And I was actually raised in Canada. And during that time, Canada has a lot of emphasis on eliminating racial discrimination. So I was educated under that context. And since I've been living in 4 countries, then there was constant adjustment to different cultures and lifestyles. And when I started teaching, I noticed that students were very eager to learn about the world outside of their countries. And for me, I was considered to be a foreigner. So as a foreigner teaching in a foreign country, then students develop this interest and they look at you in the eyes and go like, wow, it's a foreigner. Can you tell us about the world? So that ignited my interest. Next slide, please. So my context is that I started off as an international student. And while I was a student in Taiwan, specifically, I was teaching English at cram schools as a foreigner. So students rarely have foreigners back then. So when they look at me and they go like, wow, you're from Canada. It's a place that I've always heard of but never been to. And then for me, I've always hated studying, but somehow I found a path to a PhD in education. And I taught English and intercultural communications in Taiwan in higher ed. And now I'm leading virtual study abroad, specifically COIL programs. I'm providing pre-departure training and debriefing using UNESCO story circles. I'm an assistant professor at Setsunan University, and I'm also a COIL coordinator. So I could talk a little bit more about how I've been promoting intercultural assessment as a COIL coordinator. And I'm teaching global citizenship, SDGs, English and Chinese at the same time. Next slide, please. So a little bit about our office, the university that I'm working at. I'm at the Global Education Office, and we only have 2 teachers. So one, that's me. Second is teacher that's responsible for teaching Japanese to students who come study abroad. And we have 4 members at our office. So it's a relatively small office. And our institution does not require assessment. And frankly, they don't really care about this. So obviously, we get no budget for assessments. And I have to turn to free assessment tools plus localization. So the tool that we've been using for the past nearly 3 years is developed by Chao from Taiwan. It's the Intercultural Competence Scale for University EFL learners. So you can find that on the internet. It's open to public. And we also do reflective writings. And then doing assessment in my context is only for the benefit of students. We have no budget, it's not required, and it's teacher design. So the teacher, which is me in the case, because I'm responsible for virtual and digital study abroad program. So I get to design what kind of tools we can use as long as it does not involve a budget. And frankly, our office doesn't really care about this, so that they even attempted to remove this pre-departure and debriefing sessions because they don't see a merit in it. But as a frontline teacher and concerned about intercultural competence, so I insisted that, hey, okay, so if you guys don't want to do it, I'll do it. I'll spend my time doing it. I don't really mind about that. So that's when we get to use the assessment tools. Okay, next slide, please. And the current projects that I have going on is one, I'm the assessment working group, ICC assessment working group co-coordinator for the World Council on Intercultural and Global Competence. So in that working group, then we're doing a global mapping of intercultural assessment practices. So we're looking to discover what kind of problems people are encountering in ICC assessments, what kind of tools are they using, methods, methodologies. So we developed 9 languages, 9 versions of this survey that we're using. And I'm sharing the English one with all of you today. So I hope that if you guys could have your input in it, and then the results will be published next year in an open access book. So at the end of our survey, if you are willing to follow up with our survey, so probably next year when the book is published, we'll send an email to everybody. We'll give you access to the book, but it's open access. And another project that we have going on is we're trying to identify assessment tools explicitly for digital environment, and we're going to start with student experiences. The thing that we were discussing was that in virtual environments, students don't like to, or they don't care as much as we do about having their cameras on. And that as educators or as someone that's a little bit older than students, we're thinking that if you don't turn on your cameras, you can't read the facial expressions. Is that going to create a problem? But to our surprise, many students don't really care about it. Then we start to reflect on this and think, so existing ICC assessment tools, generally, that was the assumption that it's on like face-to-face intercultural communications exchanges. So what happens if we use those tools in virtual environment? So we're looking into that these 2 months, and we'll continue developing a project on this. And then one thing that I would like to mention is that I'm the co-coordinator for our university. I'm the only person that's doing ICC assessment. But then as I became the COIL coordinator, as I start to involve more teachers to try to do COIL, collaborative online international learning or virtual exchange with people from different parts of the world, I let them know that, okay, so it's only just teaching together, but then we have opportunities to publish together. Then they turn to me and they say, publishing, okay, it's interesting, teachers want it, what can we publish? And I suggest to them, we can use assessments. And that's when many teachers at my institution started to have some, they started to have some knowledge about intercultural competence assessments or global competence assessments. And as we look more and more into the assessment tools that are available, thanks to Katherine sharing that huge list, then many teachers started to become more comfortable with the idea of assessments. Other than that, before they started doing COIL, even though we are teachers at Department of Foreign Languages or International Studies, they were not familiar with the concept of assessing intercultural competence. So I thought this is a kind of valuable experience to share with everybody, that being a COIL coordinator could kind of affect or influence others, especially on introducing the availability of ICC assessments. Okay, thank you. That's all from me for now.
Thank you so much, Curtis. And I'll invite Katherine and Mattia to turn back their cameras so we can engage in some discussions and maybe address some questions that have been popping up. We have only a few for now, so feel free to send more questions. I do have one to get us started, which builds on something that Linda shared on the chat regarding the question that was asked about the IDI, but also connected to what do you want to measure, right? And I would love to hear from the three of you or any of you who wants to share, because I feel it can be overwhelming, right? Even if you have a lot of tools that have been curated, but how as a practitioner, what are some insights or tips you have for us to choose which tool we want? And I believe that's very connected to framing what we want to measure, right?
I think Katherine should go first.
Yes.
Sorry. Because you're kind of the person that have all the tools, so you kind of.
I think we have just completed a handout that I'll have to send to Carol afterwards, and maybe she can make it available, which walks you through decision points about how you should decide how to measure. So as you referenced, Curtis, first thing that is, I don't have a budget. Well, that doesn't mean you shouldn't assess. There's you can write up a focus group protocol. You can look for free tools that are out there and that are already validated. But we do have a handout on how you should, what are some things you should take into account. It's very academic, higher education focused. I think it could benefit from some input from some non-formal educators. But I'm happy to send that to Carol so that she can include it in the materials when the recording goes out.
Good. Curtis or Mattia, you want to comment on that as well?
Mattia, sorry, I interrupted. Mattia, please.
That's all right. That's all right, Curtis. Well, actually, yes, this is the basic question of assessment. What we want to assess. Before any assessment, we need to understand what we want to assess. Usually we say some general answer like intercultural competence, for instance. And so what we do usually, any one of us, go in the literature and try to understand which framework are already designed in terms of the competence. But then we need we have to choose something. And the way that I did this was to understand what was in line with the context. So for example, we use mainly Deirdre's model because it was designed specifically in international education rather than in other contexts, for instance. And then we try, when we decide the framework, we need to understand what the component of the model means in that framework. For instance, in any framework, there is curiosity, openness, whatever it is. But what does it mean in that specific context? And this is, for instance, we spent about 3 years to understand what intercultural competence means in pupil mobility. And only after that, we started to design, and before looking for, but we didn't find anything in terms of assessment of pupils in terms of intercultural competence. So we decided to try to create our own tools. So we started to the general, what we want to assess, intercultural competence, what it means intercultural competence in our context, and that what are the tools in line with, and also tools that need to be sustainable. We cannot pretend to have a tool that is perfect from the academic point of view, and then no one can use it in the schools, for instance, in my case. So that are my tips.
I think my response to this question, like, what do you want to assess, is very different from Mattia and Katherine, because I'm more of like a frontline teacher. So the typical response would be like, we should look at models but for me, it's more like, what do we want students to get? Yeah. So for us, like in my context, as mentioned before, no requirement. Why am I still doing this? Nobody's asking to do it. And if I do it, I'm not gonna get a promotion. I'm not gonna get praised. But students, what do we want them to get from participating in our study abroad or virtual study abroad programs? So one of which is that I want them to see and reflect on how comfortable they are interacting with people that's different. Especially many of our students at our university, we're a very local university. So probably about 95% of our students are from the local region within 2 hours of commuting distance. And this also means that many of them have not traveled abroad before, not having a lot of experience interacting with foreigners before, someone that's different than them. And as you probably understand, that Japan's culture is very collective or mono in a way. So they are really uncomfortable working with people that's different. Then stemming from there, I chose some kind of some assessments, and because we want to let students reflect on the experience of the virtual study abroad and let them to think more about, so okay, after this experience, do you feel comfortable or more comfortable or less comfortable? Why or why not?
Thank you. And we have many questions now popping up. I'm gonna combine 3 of them. So we have one from Kat Felder, and she's curious about assessment work being done in teacher education programs on these topics, either global or intercultural competence. Also, who else? Sorry. Myra Visbal also asked about, so we have teacher education, and now we have internationalization of the curriculum. Are there any specific tools for this too? And finally, a question, not a question, a comment from Bettina, which is also related to this in a way, but Bettina Hansel mentions that she has found in her work that it's clearly possible to teach to the IDI, right, to the Intercultural Development Inventory, and I imagine teaching to the dimensions for developmental model of intercultural sensitivity that the IDI is based. But how do we distinguish the learning gained from an international experience from what is given in the instruction, right? So this differentiation between content, measuring content and learning related about intercultural and global competence topics, and really the competences that are developed. So who wants to start?
No, well, I guess I'll jump in since I like to jump in when others are quiet. So that's my conversational style. That doesn't mean that Curtis or Mattia might not have more important stuff to say. I just thank you, Bettina, for your question. I think I'd like to talk to that one. So yes, in some sense, a professor is always teaching to the test. And so we can teach to the IDI, we can teach to the cultural intelligence scale, and those will tell you things. The surveys will only tell you what they're intended to gather. This is why this tool, which is so multimodal, is a very important tool. It will capture stuff kind of around the spectrum of intended and unintended learning. If one has to use a survey, we've had some luck with what I might call broad spectrum surveys. So they measure a lot of traits of intercultural or global competence. There is a tool that was developed from the Intercultural Competence Rubric, which is the Intercultural Attitude, Skills, and Knowledge, ASK. It was by Dr. Chuck Callahan at Purdue in our Center for Instructional Excellence. It measures 6 things, and quite often we have found that when professors use that, they were teaching to communication, but in fact they were teaching to openness, or they were teaching to empathy, and so the students are developing more strongly in those areas than they were in just their communication skills. So in short, I would say more than one method of assessment, not necessarily quantitative, or if you're going to go quantitative, use a broad spectrum instrument. The other one that, but it's expensive, is the beliefs, events, and values, which also measures across a variety of outcomes.
Thank you, Katherine. And anyone else want to address these questions or related to assessment in the internationalization of the curriculum or in case of teacher education?
So I don't know if I can say something. I try. So one of the main problems that I found when I go to the schools and to do this teacher training on internationalization of schools, the first point is the schools are quite nationalistic. So they pay a lot of attention on the national content. So the Italian literature, in my case, the Italian or Europe history, and so on and so forth. So when they have one pupil who go abroad, they are a bit surprised when they come back, because they might have some, other content or other way to teach the same subjects. And what we want to do with the Intercultura assessment protocol is not only, as I mentioned, assess this, this intercultural competence, or whatever you want to call, so you understand what I mean with this, but as well to engage the teachers in, in their personal path to understand their personal intercultural competence somehow, because they starting to see what they do for professional reason every day from a different perspective. So I guess that if the teacher need only to assess the content, like the only thing they usually do is the student who go abroad, he or she didn't do this, didn't do this. So they focus on what they didn't done rather than what they gain. But if we focus more on transversal competence of skills, intercultural competence, so we will understand what the student gain from this experience. And this help professionally to see the school not from the content perspective, from the disciplinary perspective, but from the citizenship perspective. Our school exists because they need to educate active global citizenship and not just a national citizen. So if we see from this perspective, I guess that the assessment can be an educative tool to see things from different perspectives. And teacher training play a crucial role on this, because it's a way to see the profession of teacher from a very, very different perspective. So I guess that this might help somehow also with the assessment.
Thank you. And maybe just to add to that, tomorrow we will have a webinar on global competence in teacher education. So just Kat, if you're interested, we did use an existing a framework that is called Globally Competent Teaching to create a survey, but there the purpose was exactly self-assessment, right? And what I hear both of you saying, and of course, our goal was not to measure pre and post. We use it as a pre and post tool in that program. But the whole idea was to foster this understanding, and through the tool, really have them reflect, and through the assessment, really enhance their global competence in that case. But Curtis, anything else you want to comment or address on these questions?
Yeah, Carol, I totally agree with that. And it just so happens that this semester I'm coordinating a COIL between Japanese pre-service teachers and US pre-service teachers. So we do pre and post tests using the assessment that we're using at our institution. But like you said, it's not really it's not for grades. There's no stakes in it, but it's more like raising the awareness that, oh, so pre-service teachers in Japan, we need something called intercultural competence. It's something that many of the teachers thought about here. It's more like their mission is I just have to know the English language well so that I can teach students. Yeah, but through this initiative and just exposing students to a certain kind of ICC assessment, which is localized, so it's in Japanese, so it's easy for them to understand, and they get to see the pre and post results. Then I think just through this kind of like really small, direct initiative, then the pre-service teachers will get to know about, oh, so intercultural competence, what kind of dimensions are there, what kind of items are there, and these might be some things that could benefit me or my students in the future. Yeah.
Thank you, Curtis. There is another set of questions, and feel free to go back or refer to the previous ones, but it's around who can access intercultural competence. Is it faculty? Is it through peer assessment? And also, what are the first steps someone should take? And here I might link back to some of what you said, right, regarding using multi-methods, right? And Mattia, that's very significant in the protocol as well, right? It's a combination of self-assessment, observation, there is a rubric. Katherine, you talked about a combination of qualitative and quantitative and how it's important to combine different tools. So any tips on this? Who can assess and how to get started in terms of first steps?
Just do it. Pick one thing, start measuring it. You may find out it's not measuring what you thought it was you were teaching. That's a very important finding. So we talk a lot about the perfect match and defining your outcomes, and this is important for teacher development. But just start measuring something tomorrow. If you spend a week deciding what you're going, a year deciding what you're going to measure, at the end you have no data and no information for improvement.
Completely agree with Katherine, actually. Yeah, because assessment is so complex. So sometimes, because this complexity is stopping us, so we need to start to make, some mistakes and learn from our mistake, because assessment is exactly this. And, if we understand assessment, not as a judgment on or ourselves, it's a way to see a picture, basically. It's to understand better what is going on. It's to give feedback to the student, to ourselves, and so forth. So exactly take an action in favor of assessment.
Just start asking those 3 questions of all your students, right? So simple.
Yeah, but just to play it safe, like some tools requires training. Yeah, just some of them.
Yes, they do.
Ones.
Yes, right. And if your professors are like mine and they're engineers and they're statisticians and they need that proof that it's valid and reliable, and then get trained and use that tool. But most of us don't have to work with engineers.
And also, AFS has in particular pedagogy. This is the experiential learning by doing. So it's another way to, to learn how to assess. Otherwise, you are not going to do anything in this regard.
And lifelong learning, right, Mattia? Like there is no arrival point.
Always.
And maybe to wrap us up, we have 8 more minutes, and I want to share some closing information. And we have many people that left us already. But one final comment is also related to one thing that popped up. Mattia, you talked about contextualization, and Curtis talked about this idea of localization and adaptation, right? Are there any other comments or discussions around that? Because one thing that is true for many things, and also here from what we are discussing, is that there is no one size fits all, right? It's like what you want to measure, what is the tool you want to start, but also depends who the audience is, right? In the case, Mattia, high school students going on pupil mobility. In your case, Curtis, higher education, collaborating virtual. In your case, Katherine, many types of assessment throughout the higher education audience. So any comments on that, on what to have in mind in terms of contextualization and localization of the tools we are choosing to use?
So in my case, no, Curtis, please, Curtis.
Thank you. I'll go first for the first and last time. Okay, yeah, so localization is particularly important in the context of Japan because the language is so indirect. And when we use tools that are from the US, the language is very direct and the translations often students don't understand. Yeah, so we have to find people that's fluent in both languages and they could really read between the lines what's being asked and translate it into a very subtle language in Japanese where only people who's fluent in Japanese could understand it. Oh, so that's what they're asking about. So the localization, I think, in my experience, is particularly important here in Japan.
Yes, in my case, it was the same because I didn't find anything specific for high school students. And nothing related to pupil mobility, and moreover, nothing in Italian. So again, also in the case of Curtis, we have some rubric or some tools for another age, another language, another context. And this is the reason why we wanted to involve the school in the development of the specific tools, because at the end of the day, who are going to use this tool are the teachers. So it was really important to try to use the tool, to pilot the tool with the teacher who are going to use this. And now when we present it, like in this case, this intercultural assessment protocol, we always wanted to underline this was developed in Italy in this way, because if you want to use it, then it would be important to rethink in your context what you have to readapt, how to rephrase some part, and so on and so forth. So thank you.
I have another take maybe on localization, and I think that's important to student motivation. So it goes back. So what's your why? Yeah. So intercultural competence was important to me because I wanted to get the heck out of Indiana as a teenager, and it was important to my parents to be cosmopolitan, right? But for many people in this state, that doesn't seem like a reasonable goal. And so if you want them to engage in the traits of intercultural competence, maybe you have to talk about it as a business skill. How do you negotiate? Maybe you have to talk about it as a science skill. How do I keep bias from creeping into my research? Maybe you have to talk about domestic diversity and skills to work effectively with people of different ethnicities, although everybody says they want to do that in the US, but I'm not so sure that they do. But you have to find that thing. With some students, I have found that just talking about being more effective on their baseball team with their other teammates is their motivator. And so localization, in that sense, getting down to what's going to matter to this group is really important.
Thank you so much, Katherine, and thank all of you. And Katherine, you just addressed one last question we had on the chat, I guess, also about how do we motivate students, right, to complete pre and post assessment? And one way is that what's in it for them, right? What they're going to get out of this. And I'll just finish by sharing, as Dylan puts on the chat, our evaluation survey for you guys to fill in and provide us feedback from today. On AFS, we currently have an online component that many of our students that go abroad take. And we leverage that to be the place where they fill in their pre and post assessment. And we call it a self-reflection tool, not pre-programmed self-assessment. We call it a self-reflection tool. And then when we have a facilitated session or an orientation that happens pre-departure or after re-entry on day return, we ask them to bring notes on their reflections on that pre and post assessment, first on pre-departure and really set their goals for their exchange and what they want to develop, and then upon their return as they debrief in the experience, right? So that can be a way as you make it part of other activities and group activities that you will be facilitating, right? Not just something isolated.
Yeah.
Go.
I mean, I would also say, give them points, right? You get 5 points towards your grade if you complete the assessment. Or recently we said we will donate $1 to the student charity on campus for everybody who completes the survey. So there are lots of ways, but showing them that their participation is important in some way. I think that's what Carol was kind of getting at.
May I add again, in one way, like telling students that this is good for you, this will like show your growth. They don't really buy it, but like many students just go like, oh, I clicked on these items just based on my intuition. That means 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. But then in my case, I made a certificate to show them like using visuals, very basic Excel, using a chart, pre and post, and make it into a certificate format that by completing these pre and post surveys and this program, you get this certificate. And then they start taking out their smartphones and scan the QR codes. Whereas before seeing a certificate that looks kind of fancy, they don't really care about it. So that might be one of the incentives.
Right, that's localization as well, right? And understanding the student culture you're working with and what's going to motivate it. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And thank you, Katherine, Mattia, and Curtis, especially Curtis for staying up late at night. It was wonderful. We do ask you to provide your feedback. And finally, just a reminder, we have other 5 webinars happening this week that AFS is offering to celebrate International Education Week. So make sure to revisit our website. And we also have something we wanted to share with you, maybe not for you, but for you to share with your students. We are currently recruiting for an upcoming AFS event next year. It's the AFS Youth Assembly. It will take place in person in New York City between the 11th and 13th of August. And we gather usually around 600 youth delegates, age 18 to 32. I'm no longer youth anymore, but maybe some here are, or it can be a great opportunity for your students to also develop their global and intercultural competence. And you see the website there. There's much more information. The focus is around the sustainable development goals and talking about ways youth can engage really as active global citizens, demonstrating intercultural and global competences amongst other competencies. So thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day, everyone.